To my colleague Andy Collins a little earlier, I recall very well the phone-in we did about 2 years ago where I asked the question, would you be prepared to lose your job for Brexit? And every single call, bar one, said yes. I was quite astonished, so I presume that means this morning you're really not bothered if companies pull out of the UK, again, as long as we Brexit. Jason Hunter is a former international trade negotiator. Good morning to you, Jason.
Good morning to you, Jonathan, and to Beds, Bucks and Hearts.
Good morning. So, yes, when I did that phone-in a couple of years ago, and I went a bit further, I asked, would you be prepared to lose your job, and would you also be prepared to see your family lose their jobs? Everyone said yes. Everyone said it was worth it. Does that surprise you?
It's astounding, isn't it, that people are that committed to something that's so dangerous for the country. I mean, that was a couple of years ago. If you look at the Brexit job losses to date, as of February the 4th, the UK has lost 208,146 jobs as a result of Brexit. There's a Facebook group called Brexit Jobs Losses. I know you're doing Facebook a little bit later, but there's a Facebook page called Brexit Job Losses who are tracking these things, and companies that are shutting down, companies that are relocating out of the country. But over 200,000 households have lost income as a result of Brexit. And we haven't even left yet, Jonathan. Imagine how bad it'll be when we do lose all those trade agreements, not just with the EU, but also with the rest of the world.
But how can we possibly say that this is all down to Brexit? I mean, for example, if you look at the Nissan decision, so the bosses of Nissan are saying that Brexit certainty is not helping. But surely you recognise it's not just about Brexit. It's also down to the fact that people don't want diesel cars anymore.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and then that's what the Brexiteers will tell you. And I'm sure if you have somebody else on the radio in a minute who's a Brexit supporter, they'll say, oh, it's nothing to do with Brexit. It's all to do with diesel cars. But the fact is, these Nissan X-Trails, they're not stopping building them. They're stopping building them in the Brexit Britain. Those X-Trails are going to be built, and they're going to be sold, and they're going to be built in Japan and sold into the European Union under a tariff-free free trade agreement like the one the UK used to have, but we're giving up. So for them to say, oh, it's got nothing to do with Brexit, it's absolute rubbish because these cars are going to be built. The new Mini, the electric Mini, the BMW Mini built in Oxfordshire, that's not going to be built in Oxfordshire either. The new electric Jaguar is being built in Slovakia. These companies are still building these cars. They're just not building them in Brexit Britain because it's not feasible.
But how can we possibly say that these companies would not have moved production of the various vehicles you've just mentioned out of the UK anyway? Because it's cheaper to make a Mini in Slovakia than it is in the UK.
That's potentially true, but since they already have their bases here, I mean, people like Nissan, they've been here for years. BMW, as I say, taking over the Mini Cooper facility. You've got Jaguar Land Rover, been here for decades and decades and decades. You've got Honda in Swindon, Toyota. They're all here. And they invested in the United Kingdom because we were the springboard for those businesses to sell into the European Union, the largest single market on the planet. The United States alone have invested over £300 billion into the United Kingdom in foreign direct investment. And the US Chambers of Commerce specifically said, this is as a result of your EU membership. When we first started talking about having a referendum and leaving the EU, they wrote a very, very strongly worded letter to Downing Street and said, look, you can't do this. We've invested all this money here. And the concern, Jonathan, is that's just $300 billion from the USA. There's another $400 billion of FDI from EU countries into the UK, and then a further $300 to $400 billion from other countries around the world, all of whom have invested in the UK, not just to sell to the UK market of 65 million people, but to sell to the largest single market on the planet with over 500 million people. When you look at those numbers, there's a thing called a BIT. When they make these investments in the UK, it's called a bilateral investment treaty between a particular company and the UK government, saying when I invest X hundreds of millions of pounds and build a factory, creating jobs, paying corporation tax and income tax, etc., when I do that in the UK, there's usually clauses in those agreements called ISDS, which is Investor State Dispute Settlement Systems. And what that means is the UK government could be open to be sued by these companies that have put money into the United Kingdom, invested here on the basis that the government was not going to change its policy of allowing them to sell into the largest single market on the planet. Now, they can then potentially sue the government for compensation for their lost profits and lost earnings as a result of Brexit.
Jason, stay there. Let me bring Dr. Graham Gudgin in, who's from the University of Cambridge and co-editor of a website called Briefings for Brexit. Good morning to you. Thanks for coming on, Graham.
Good morning to you.
Morning. So if you listen to Jason, Brexit is really bad news for a lot of businesses. We're now seeing the effect, as many of those businesses either talk of no longer investing in this country or pulling their headquarters out of this country, or potentially even pulling some of their workforce out of this country. Is it time to conclude that economically Brexit is showing itself to be very bad for this nation?
No, of course it isn't. And my gosh, what a one-sided account you just had from Jason. It's hard to correct
Factual account.
Hard to correct everything he said. But let me say one thing straight away. He said there was a loss of, I think, 280,000 jobs. Well, that's very strange because employment has actually increased since the referendum in the UK by 800,000.
You see, you're making a mistake confusing the jobs that are available and the jobs that have been lost, because unemployment, it does not reflect the number of jobs. There are plenty of jobs. In fact, we've got so many jobs in this country that we don't have enough people to do them. Take just the NHS. There's over 200,000 job vacancies in the NHS, and as you say, we don't have enough people to fill those jobs.
Sorry, I didn't say that at all. I didn't mention that unemployment. I said we'd created another 800,000 jobs. There's been a huge...
Which are not filled.
The joke. No, sorry, those are filled jobs. Of course they are. The joke among Brexiteers is that we have full employment in the UK, but how much better it could have been if we hadn't have voted to leave the UK in 2016. We have full employment. The job situation has been absolutely terrific. And yet, remain like Jason.
Tell that to the NHS. Tell that to patients who cannot get treated. Tell that to people who are lying in hospital beds where the nurse doesn't have time to get around to everybody, to turn them in their beds at night, to make sure their medications are given. There are over 200,000 job vacancies in the NHS which we cannot fill because nurse applications from the EU have fallen by 92%.
But then if that's true, Jason, if that's true, does it matter if we lose... Hang on a second, Graham. Does it matter if we lose jobs, for example, in Nissan or Toyota or Airbus? Because can't those people just go and work in the NHS instead?
Well, with training, I'd imagine, yeah, in a few years' time, in several years' time. One of the government proposals is, because we don't have enough doctors either, is they're talking about fast-tracking nurses to become doctors in a shorter period of time. Now, the Brexiteers didn't put that on a big red bus, but your doctors in hospitals and GP surgeries are going to be less well qualified than they were before.
But the point is, if there are lots of jobs in the country, should we mourn the loss of jobs if some of these companies decide to not invest in this country?
Well, absolutely we should, because you're losing corporation tax, you're losing PAYE income tax, you're losing national insurance income, and this all comes out of the HM Treasury budget. Because the government, at the end of the day, they don't have any money. All they have is what people pay in taxes. Now, if you're losing jobs and companies are shutting down and relocating out of the country, HM Treasury's income is going down, while at the same time you've got 208,000 more people claiming benefits. And so you've got higher welfare bills, you've got higher NHS bills, yet you've got less money to do it. This is what causes austerity over a longer period of time.
Graham, you want to come in?
Well, look, gosh, it's hard to know how to deal with this. So, just almost all of this is wrong.
Brexiteers have trouble dealing with facts. Brexiteers always have trouble dealing with factual information.
Do you notice how Jason always comes in and butts in and tries to interrupt? I didn't interrupt him once. All of this is wrong. The NHS facts were all wrong. There's been a big increase in recruitment by the NHS since the referendum. If you compare,
do you have any evidence for that whatsoever? Do you have any evidence for that? Can you point our listeners to a document somewhere?
Yes, of course I can. The NHS quarterly employment figures, they're produced every quarter. The last ones were produced in December. Have a look at them.
Look at the vacancies in the job adverts.
No, look at the number of people they've employed. There has been, as you said, a fall. Look. Just let me speak, Jason.
Go ahead.
If you want to listen to yourself, just play it to yourself. But there has been a fall in the NHS recruitment from the EU, but that's more than been made up by recruitment of people from the UK. just what employers were telling us couldn't happen. They couldn't recruit indigenous labour instead of people from the EU, and that's exactly what has happened in the NHS. The NHS has shortages all over the place. That's nothing to do with the EU. That's to do with austerity. It's to do with a lack of money in the NHS.
But Graham, since Brexit, almost 10,000 EU health workers have quit the National Health Service.
Yeah, and then I just said, look, you have to listen, Jason. As I just said, that their numbers have been more than made up by recruitment of people from within the UK. So a lot of people within the UK have got jobs. So Jonathan's original question: would you be willing to lose your job for Brexit? Is a completely irrelevant question because no one is losing their jobs. The employment in the UK is doing
true.
far better than the
that is
rest
just
of the.
Not true.
Yes, look. I mean, Cambridge University.
Nobody's lost their job as a result of Brexit. You think nobody's lost their job as a result of Brexit? That is just factually incorrect.
There's change going on all the time. There's been a huge increase in employment. As I say, 800,000 extra jobs, filled jobs, since the referendum.
How are you defining a job? Are you defining a job the same way the government do, which means if you work for more than 1 hour a week, then you're effectively employed?
There's been an increase of over 500,000 in full-time jobs, even if we leave the part-time jobs out of this. Obviously, Jason doesn't often look at Office of National Statistics data on employment.
So
the employment situation, as we all know, has been terrific in the last few years.
So, Graham, can I just ask you? Sorry to interrupt you, but I'm just interested. I played a little clip in my opening to this discussion today from the pro-Brexit economist Patrick Minford, who is one of the economists that has always suggested that Brexit would be great for this country. But even he has suggested that, to quote him, you would need to run down the car industry. Kind of in the same way that the coal industry was run down by Margaret Thatcher. Do you think that's what needs to happen then? Do we need to see a lot of companies being run down? And do you think that those jobs will simply move into other areas instead?
No. I know Patrick Minford well. I've known him for 30 or 40 years. He takes a much more extreme view than I do of these things. He's not only talking about Brexit. He's a great fan of free trade. So he would like to get rid of all tariffs to everyone, have a completely open market, in which case we wouldn't be competitive in some industries, but he thinks we would be even more competitive in others. So there would be quite a big change. I think that degree of change is disruptive. So I don't agree with Patrick. But yet he's not really talking about Brexit per se. He's talking about Brexit plus getting rid of all tariffs. So we don't charge any tariffs to anyone in the world. It would help people in having very cheap food, for instance. We could import cheap from the food from the cheapest sources. Argentinian beef, American beef, all these sorts of things.
What would then happen to the agriculture sector and farmers in the United Kingdom if we import all this cheap food with different standards to the standards we currently got? What happens to British farmers and British agriculture, British arable farmers, British dairy farmers, British meat farmers? What happens to all these people while at the same time you're removing the Common Agricultural Policy funding, which is up to sort of 40 to 60% of their income? You take away 46 to 60% of a farmer's income. At the same time, it's flooding him with cheap competition. What do you think is going to happen to the British farming sector?
Graham?
I think it will get smaller, but I'm not advocating this.
Well, hang on a minute. You think it will get smaller, so that means farms will go out of business?
Exactly.
Sorry, who's saying that? Is that Jason? Or
No, it's Jonathan. I'm just trying to clarify the point. You say it will get smaller. So the reality of that is, if the farming sector gets smaller, that means farms go out of business. Yes.
Just to be clear, I'm not advocating this, and nor is any of the Brexit campaigns. This is an extreme view of Patrick Minford.
But you just talked about how good it would be to have cheaper food.
Yes, I'm explaining to you what Patrick Minford believes. That's
so you don't believe we should have cheaper food?
In some cases, I mean, we could drop tariffs on things we don't produce, like oranges, for instance. Well, why on earth do we have tariffs on oranges? We do that to protect Spanish orange growers. We'll have no need to protect Spanish orange growers after the 29th of March.
We buy oranges from Spain tariff-free. You know that, right? Because we're part of the European Union and part of the single market and part of the customs union. We have no friction when we import oranges from Spain, and they're tariff-free.
But we can only do that for part of the year when they're in season. For the rest of the year, we have to import them at tariffs from the rest of the world, and we won't have to do that after the 29th of March.
But I thought we reduced. I thought we reduced the tariffs then as soon as they're no longer in season in the EU.
We do, but we don't get rid of them altogether.
Right.
Yeah. So look, we will have some cheaper food, but this isn't a big argument. I was merely explaining to you what Patrick Minford believes and saying that his view, what he advocates, is in my view an extreme.
But isn't this all totally relevant in terms of this discussion about certain companies pulling out of the UK, certain companies suggesting that Brexit is having an effect on them and their interest in employing people in this country? That has a knock-on effect. It affects that, and it will potentially, particularly if we leave with no deal, it will have a much bigger effect on many more companies and industries and sectors in this country.
Let's come back to Nissan. That's the thing that everybody's interested in today. Nissan's decision has got very little to do with Brexit per se. It's to do with two big things. One is the fall in demand for diesel engines. They were going to bring the diesel engines in from France to build this 4x4 in Sunderland, but that's no longer economic to do so. Nothing to do with Brexit, all to do with diesel emission problems. The alternative would be to
they're still building the cars.
The alternative would be to have a petrol engine car, but they then bring the petrol engines in from Japan, moving them halfway across the world, and that's not economic. So they've decided not to make this new 4x4 in Sunderland. That will mean 400 jobs less, but those aren't 400 existing jobs. They're jobs which would have appeared over the next few years.
So the economy will be smaller as a result of these cars being built in another country, not built in Britain. Brexit Britain. These cars they're not stopping building the cars because nobody's buying diesel. They're relocating where they're going to manufacture the cars. Under the new tariff-free trade agreement with the European Union, they can still sell them into the European Union tariff-free. If they were built in Sunderland, they could do the same. You talk about that being the diesel being the issue, but what about the electric Mini being built abroad? What about the new electric Jag being built in Slovakia? They're relocating out because they don't want to build in a Brexit Britain where we have all these new frictions and barriers at our borders and tariffs imposed on us by all of our customer countries all over the world.
Sorry, you made those points earlier. Let me reply to them now. My understanding is they aren't going to build the diesel 4x4. They're going to build a petrol version, which they will build in Japan where they already make the engines. And they can now import those tariff-free into the UK because of the new Japan.
So why would the bosses, Graham? I totally take the point about diesel, and I think it's absolutely relevant. I think most sensible people can see that there is obviously an effect of diesel. But why would the bosses of Nissan, in their letter to their employees, say, and I quote, "Brexit uncertainty is not helping firms to plan for the future"?
No, that's true. I talked to Japanese officials earlier in the week, but before this decision was announced, and they stressed to me the importance of uncertainty. This is a general point, I think, with Japanese car companies, that they dislike uncertainty. And I think we're in a ridiculous position that we've got within 8 weeks of leaving the EU, and we still don't know whether we're going to have tariffs. I mean, this is terrible. And of course, it's the problem is every bit due to Brussels as it is to anything in the UK. But nevertheless, that isn't the big factor here. That's just a general factor. And if you read their letter carefully, they're not saying that's a big factor in this particular decision. They're just saying it's a general problem that faces Nissan, as indeed it does other Japanese car companies in the UK.
It's not just car companies, though, George. I mean, if you think back to the Mongolia round of the World Economic Forum, When they were sitting out there, the Japanese presented a 20-page document to British representatives and said, look, and it's very rare for the Japanese to do that, and say, look, we are advising Japanese companies to reduce their investment in the United Kingdom as a result of the referendum. Now they're reducing. Now they're making final decisions 2.5 years on. And they're actually not just not investing, they're removing current planned investments into the United Kingdom. And not just Nissan, not just Toyota and BMW and all the car industry. You've got Panasonic already gone, Sony already gone. Lots of Japanese companies are already moving out of the country. And that's not including any of the US ones that have held off their investments in the UK. Look at FDI in any currency other than the British pound, which is pretty much worthless compared to where it used to be. Then our foreign direct investment in the UK has disappeared. Virtually disappeared.
Okay, let Graham come back in. Go on, Graham.
Are we trying to have an intelligent discussion here? Sorry, I think Jason just said that I think he just said that the pound was virtually worthless.
Compared to where it was before. We've lost nearly 18% of its value in 2 years. We were the worst performing currency on the planet in the year 2016-17, second only to the Guatemalan quetzal. That's how bad British currency has been trading in the last couple of years.
Yes, but it was overvalued before. It's now at some sort of reasonable value. To say that currency is worthless is a ridiculous overstatement.
Comparatively.
Comparative to what? You said comparative to what it was. Look, it's either worthless or it isn't. Look, that's a ridiculous overstatement. I think it puts into context almost everything else you've been saying, which is also overstatement in this discussion.
Today, George, is the pound worth less today than it was 2.5 years ago? Of course, it's worth less today than it was 2 years ago. It's worth about 18% less, and we still haven't even left the EU yet.
Yes, but it was overvalued before, so it's compared to its long-term value, it's about right. Right. And it's good that it's not overvalued because we want to sell a lot.
Okay, listen, we must leave it there because we're out of time, but very interesting. Jason Hunter is a former international trade negotiator. Dr. Graham Gudgin is from the University of Cambridge and a co-editor of a website called Briefings for Brexit. Well, my question to you, does it matter to you if companies pull out of the UK as long as we Brexit? Does it matter? Maybe you're of the opinion that actually we do just need to, in the same way that we did in the 80s when we lost all of the coal mines and those jobs went, we need to have a complete change. Yes, OK, we'll see the loss of some of these jobs. Doesn't really matter. People can go and work for hospitals instead. There are other jobs that they can do. 08081 008800. Does it matter to you if companies pull out of the UK as long as we Brexit?
Travel for bed.